Here you
Imagine
go,
having
sweetie.
everything:
A little treat
wealth,
for you.
respect,
Oh,
a
thank
life
you.
that
That
others
means a
envy,
lot.
and then losing it all in an instant. This is exactly what happened to Gustavo, a once successful millionaire whose world collapsed overnight. Stripped of everything he held dear, he found himself sitting on a cold, unforgiving sidewalk with his young daughter, Eduarda, starving and desperate. People walked by, ignoring their pain, until one woman, a humble janitor named Priscilla, decided to stop. What she did next would change everything. She didn't hesitate. She didn't care about status or wealth. She cared about humanity. And in that simple act of kindness, she gave Gustavo and his daughter something far more valuable than food: hope. Gustavo sat on the cracked sidewalk, his face buried in his trembling hands. His expensive suit, once a symbol of his success, was now wrinkled and dirty. The weight of humiliation pressed down on him like a heavy blanket. He glanced over at his daughter, Eduarda, who was curled up next to him, clutching her worn-out dress. Her little face, usually full of life and curiosity, now looked defeated. It had been 5 days since they had a proper meal, and her stomach growled softly, a sound that cut through him like a knife. "Pie," to calm foam, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Gustavo reached into his pockets for the 10th time that day, hoping against hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a coin or two left. But there was nothing. Empty. He cursed under his breath and looked at the ground. His pride, once unshakable, had crumbled along with his business. He had been a successful tech entrepreneur, the owner of a company worth millions. But all of that vanished in the blink of an eye. A trusted accountant, someone he'd known for over a decade, had stolen everything. Falsified documents, siphoned funds, and left him with nothing. His company went bankrupt, his house was repossessed, and his once thriving life had turned into a nightmare. Gustavo wiped the sweat off his brow, feeling the sting of the afternoon sun burning his skin. People walked by, avoiding eye contact, their footsteps echoing in the quiet, indifferent to the broken man and his daughter sitting on the pavement. Some glanced over in judgment, others in disgust. A group of teenagers walked past, snickering as they stopped in front of him. "Look at this." The once successful businessman reduced to begging on the street, one of them laughed. "What a loser. Probably incompetent. Lost everything." Gustavo felt his face flush with shame. His hands trembled as the humiliation hit him like a wave. The laughter of the teens echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. He couldn't meet their eyes. How had he gone from having everything to having nothing? Eduarda sniffled softly, wiping her tears on her sleeve. "Pie, when are we going home?" she asked, her voice cracking. Gustavo choked back the lump in his throat. "Soon, sweetheart. We'll go home soon," he lied. He knew deep down that there was no home to go back to, no place to escape the crushing reality of his situation. Her small hands reached out, pointing to a bakery across the street. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, torturing him further. Eduarda's eyes lit up as she looked up at him, her voice filled with hope. "Can we get a bread pie?" Gustavo shook his head, his heart breaking. "Not today, darling. We don't have enough." The words tasted like acid in his mouth. How could he tell his daughter that they didn't even have enough for the simplest of comforts? The bread, the food, the basic things every child deserved. His pride, once invincible, had now been replaced with guilt and hopelessness. As Eduarda sat back down, her tiny frame curled into a ball of sadness, something caught Gustavo's eye. A woman. She was walking towards them, her steps purposeful, but she looked different from the rest. Her clothes were simple, worn from long hours of work, but there was a kind of strength in the way she carried herself. It was Priscilla, the janitor from a bakery just across the street. She had just finished her shift, her uniform soaked in sweat, but she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes met Gustavo's, and for a moment they locked, a silent understanding passing between them. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the pain he was trying to hide. Without saying a word, Priscilla reached into her pocket and pulled out a small amount of cash, just enough to buy a meal. She walked into the bakery, her eyes never leaving Eduarda, who was still sitting quietly on the pavement. When Priscilla returned, she didn't hand Gustavo the money. Instead, she walked up to the little girl, crouching down to meet her gaze. "Oi, pequeña, what's your name?" she asked gently, her voice soft, reassuring. Eduarda looked up at her, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, unsure of whether to speak. She looked back at her father, seeking permission. Gustavo nodded slightly, giving her the go-ahead. "Eduarda," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name." Priscilla smiled warmly before reaching in her bag. "I brought you something," she said, pulling out 2 warm loaves of bread and 2 ice creams. "Are you hungry?" Eduarda's eyes lit up, and for the first time in days, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She nodded eagerly, taking the bread and biting into it with urgency, as though she hadn't tasted food in weeks. Priscilla handed her an ice cream, and Eduarda's face lit up with pure joy. She took a lick, savoring the cold treat, a real smile finally breaking through the sadness. It was a moment of relief, a small gift of kindness that made her feel human again. Gustavo watched, stunned. It wasn't just the food, it was the way Priscilla had treated them, with dignity and compassion. No judgment, no hesitation, just pure kindness. He looked at her, his throat tight with emotion. How could someone with so little give so much? Priscilla then turned to him, holding out another loaf of bread. "You should eat too," she said softly. Gustavo's eyes filled with tears. I don't have money to pay you," he said, his voice thick with shame. "Who said anything about paying?" Priscilla smiled. "Everyone deserves to eat. You don't need money to show kindness." Gustavo took the bread with shaking hands. It wasn't just food that she was offering him. It was a reminder that in the midst of his worst days, there was still good in the world. He tried to speak, but couldn't. The tears flowed freely now, a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "Thank you," he whispered, barely able to say the words. Priscilla smiled and nodded, standing up to leave. "You'll be okay," she said, as she turned to walk away. As Priscilla disappeared into the busy street, Gustavo sat there, still holding the bread, his heart swelling with a strange mix of hope and disbelief. It was the first time in weeks that he felt something other than despair. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The next few days felt like a blur. Gustavo sat with Eduarda in the same spot on the sidewalk, his pride still shattered, but a flicker of hope slowly starting to grow inside him. Priscilla came by every day, bringing food, talking to Eduarda, and sharing small moments of laughter. Despite the circumstances, Eduarda began to smile again. It was small, fragile, but it was there, and that made all the difference. Gustavo couldn't explain it, but something about Priscilla's kindness brought him comfort. She didn't look at them like they were beneath her. She didn't pity them. She saw them. She saw him. Priscilla's visits were always brief, just a few minutes to hand over a loaf of bread, some juice, or even just to sit for a while with Eduarda, letting the little girl braid her hair or tell her a funny story. It was in these simple moments that Gustavo began to feel a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time, dignity. But his pride still held him back. Every time Priscilla handed him food or offered help, he wanted to refuse, to say that he was fine, that they didn't need anything. But he couldn't. The truth was he was starving, not just for food, but for hope, for kindness, for a way out of the endless darkness that seemed to surround him. One morning, after a particularly harsh night where he couldn't sleep due to hunger and a nagging worry about his daughter's future, Gustavo decided to do something he never thought he would. He took a deep breath, gathered what was left of his courage, and stood up as Priscilla approached. "Priscilla," he said, his voice cracking, I don't know how to thank you." Priscilla paused, looking up from the small bag of food she had brought, her brow furrowed. "You don't need to thank me," she replied softly. "Everyone deserves a little kindness. But you've done so much for us," Gustavo continued, his voice filled with a mix of gratitude and shame. "I've lost everything. I can't even provide for my daughter, let alone repay you for your kindness." Priscilla shook her head. "You don't have to repay me," she said, her voice steady. "We help each other when we can. That's what matters." Her words struck a chord in Gustavo. He had spent so much of his life thinking he had to do everything on his own, that he had to be the one in control, the one with all the answers. But here he was broken, desperate, and in need of help. And somehow, this woman, who had nothing to her name, was showing him what real strength and humanity were. "Please," Priscilla continued, sensing his inner turmoil. "You're not alone in this. You don't have to do it all by yourself." Gustavo looked down at Eduarda, who was playing with a stick on the sidewalk, lost in her world for a moment. The sight of her innocence in the midst of all this pain stirred something in him. He had always been her protector, the one who promised her everything would be okay. But now, for the first time, he felt like he couldn't keep that promise. Not without help. He took a step forward, his mind racing. "I need a job," he said, the words coming out of his mouth before he had time to think them through. "I need something, anything. I need to find a way to provide for her. I can't keep living like this." Priscilla's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know you're trying, Gustavo. I can see it, and that's all that matters. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know you're a good man, and you'll find a way." Gustavo swallowed hard, feeling the lump in his throat grow. He had spent so long avoiding the reality of his situation, afraid to admit how much he had lost. But now, hearing Priscilla's words, he felt like a weight was lifting, if only just a little. He wasn't alone, and that realization made all the difference. Later that day, after Priscilla had left, he gathered his strength and went to the bakery where she worked. The heat from the oven hit him as he walked inside, and the smell of fresh bread made his stomach growl even louder. He approached the counter where the baker, SCU Mario, was standing. "Excuse me," Gustavo said hesitantly. "I was wondering if you might have any work. I need something, anything." SCU Mario looked up from the dough he was kneading, his eyes narrowing as he took in Gustavo's disheveled appearance. "You? What happened to you, huh? Used to be a millionaire, right? You think I'd hire someone like you?" Gustavo felt his chest tighten. He had expected this kind of reaction, but it still stung. "Please, I'm not asking for much. Just enough to help me get back on my feet." SCU Mario snorted. "You're wasting my time. I don't hire people like you. Get out." Gustavo stood there for a moment, his pride bruised, but he didn't back down. He wasn't giving up yet. He turned and walked out of the bakery, but the feeling of rejection weighed heavily on his heart. He spent the rest of the day trying other places, restaurants, shops, any business that might give him a chance. Each time he was met with cold stares, dismissive responses, or worse, complete indifference. By the time the sun began to set, he had a painful realization. No one was going to give him a chance. No one was going to help him rebuild his life. But then, the thought of Eduarda's face, of her innocent smile when Priscilla had handed her the bread, kept him moving. He wasn't going to give up, not for himself, but for her. He would keep trying, even if the world seemed to close its doors in his face. That night, as they sat in the small corner of the street they had been calling home, Eduardo curled up beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. She didn't say anything, but the way she clung to him told him everything he needed to know. She trusted him. She needed him. And for the first time in days, Gustavo felt like he might have a shot at fixing this. Maybe it wasn't much. Maybe it wasn't easy. But he would keep fighting. For Eduarda. For their future. And somehow, Priscilla's simple acts of kindness had given him the courage to do that. The following days were a blur of rejection, exhaustion, and moments of fleeting hope. Gustavo woke up each morning, determined to find work, but every door seemed to shut in his face. He scoured job listings, visited countless businesses, and knocked on doors. Yet, each time he was met with a cold refusal, a reminder that the world had no place for someone who had lost everything. He wasn't the man he used to be, and nobody seemed to care about the man he was trying to become. Priscilla, however, kept showing up without fail. Every day, she brought food, small meals, snacks, sometimes just a hot drink to warm them up in the chill of the morning. But it wasn't just the food, it was the conversations, the gentle encouragement, and the way she made him feel like he wasn't invisible, like he was still worthy of kindness, despite everything that had happened. On the fourth day of his relentless job search, Gustavo was sitting in a small park, his mind spinning with frustration and hopelessness. Eduarda was playing on the swings, her laughter ringing out like music to his ears. He watched her with a sense of deep love and guilt. She deserved so much more than this. A father who could provide for her, a future that wasn't clouded by the weight of uncertainty. But as the hours wore on, he felt his energy waning, and his hope seemed to slip further out of reach. It was then that Priscilla found him, sitting alone on a park bench, staring into the distance. "Hey," she said softly, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She sat next to him, her usual smile absent, replaced with a look of concern. "I can't find anything, Pri," Gustavo admitted, his voice low, tired. "I've tried everything. No one wants to hire me. No one even cares. It's like I don't exist anymore." Priscilla didn't say anything at first. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small package wrapped in crinkled brown paper. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "This is for you and Eduarda." Gustavo looked at the package, then back at her, his eyebrows furrowed. "You don't need to do this. You've already done so much for us. I'm not sure how much longer we can take this." Priscilla smiled, a knowing, compassionate smile that made something inside Gustavo tighten. "I don't do it because I have to. I do it because I want to. You don't have to carry this burden on your own." He hesitated, but then unwrapped the package. Inside, there were 2 sandwiches, each neatly wrapped, and a small bottle of juice. Simple food, but to him, it was more than just a meal. It was an act of kindness that cut through the layers of despair that had been building inside him. He met her gaze, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been more of a help to us than anyone I know. You've shown me what real kindness looks like. And I don't know how to thank you for that." Priscilla smiled, but there was no arrogance, no sense of superiority in her demeanor. She just nodded. "You don't need to thank me, Gustavo. We're all in this together. That's what makes us human. You've got a lot of fight left in you. You just need to keep going." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so caught up in his own shame and frustration that he had stopped seeing the people around him, the people who could help him when he was at his lowest. He had forgotten that kindness wasn't just about receiving, it was about giving too. He had to let others help him, and in turn, he could one day return that favor. Later that evening, as they sat together in the park, Gustavo took a long, deep breath. He looked at his daughter, who was now sitting next to Priscilla, eating her sandwich with delight, and something stirred in him. It wasn't just the overwhelming need to provide for Eduarda. It was the sense of responsibility, the deep desire to protect her, to show her that no matter how hard things got, they would never give up. "Priscilla," he said, his voice steady, "I've made a decision." She turned to him, waiting for him to continue. "I can't give up. I've been running from this reality for too long. I've been so wrapped up in what I lost that I forgot what I still have. I have Eduarda. I have you. And I'm not going to let us fall into nothing. I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to find a way to fix this." Priscilla's eyes softened, and she placed a gentle hand on his. "That's the spirit, Gustavo. You're stronger than you think." For the first time in days, Gustavo felt a sense of purpose. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. He didn't have to do it alone. He had people in his corner. Priscilla, with her quiet strength and compassion, had reminded him of that. The next morning, after another sleepless night, Gustavo woke up with a renewed sense of determination. He took Eduarda's hand and headed out to continue his search, this time with a clearer mind. He still didn't know where the path would lead, but he knew that every door that closed meant another would open. And with Priscilla's encouragement, he was ready to knock on every one of them. Hours later, as he passed by the bakery, he saw Priscilla inside, wiping down tables after a busy morning rush. For a moment, their eyes met, and she gave him a small but knowing smile. He didn't stop this time. He walked on, but the weight of his decision settled in his chest like a warm promise. "I'm not going to give up," he whispered to himself. "Not for me, and definitely not for her." The road ahead was still uncertain, but Gustavo knew now that he wasn't walking it alone. He had hope, something he had nearly lost, and that was more than enough to keep going. And as he kept searching for work, he carried with him the quiet strength that Priscilla had given him, strength born not from wealth or status, but from kindness, compassion, and the unwavering belief that things could get better, if only he kept fighting. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between hope and despair grew. Gustavo's determination didn't waver, but it was constantly tested. He had become accustomed to the routine of rejection. Each day, he woke up early, walked the streets with Eduarda by his side, and knocked on doors, asking for any job he could get. The world outside seemed indifferent to his struggle. He was just another man with a broken past and a desperate need for a second chance. But then, on a particularly cold morning, something unexpected happened. After another fruitless search, Gustavo was walking back to his makeshift home when he passed a small office building with a sign in the window. Office assistant needed. Apply within. It wasn't much, but it was something. Gustavo hesitated for a moment, thinking about the countless applications he'd filled out before, all of which had ended in cold rejection. But today felt different. Maybe it was the way the sun pierced through the clouds, or the thought of Eduarda's bright eyes. Whatever it was, he pushed open the door. The receptionist, a young woman in her 20s, looked up as he entered. Her eyes briefly scanned him before she put on a polite smile. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I saw the sign in your window. I need a job." I can work," Gustavo stammered, trying to make his voice sound confident. "Anything, really. I can help with anything." The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Do you have experience?" she asked. "Yes," Gustavo said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I used to run a business. I have experience with office work, administration, managing teams. I just need a chance." The woman looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words. Then, with a small sigh, she gestured for him to take a seat. "Wait here. I'll tell Mr. Santos you're here," she said, before disappearing into the back office. Gustavo sat, his palms sweating as he fidgeted nervously. His heart pounded in his chest, the familiar fear rising inside him. He had been through so many interviews that had led nowhere. What if this was just another disappointment? But this time, he couldn't let fear dictate his actions. He couldn't walk away from this opportunity without trying. A few minutes later, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit walked out from the back office. He had a no-nonsense demeanor, his gray hair neatly combed, his posture straight. The man looked at Gustavo with a calculating expression. "Mr. Mendez?" he asked, holding out his hand. "Yes, sir," Gustavo replied, shaking the man's hand firmly, trying to hide the tremor in his own. "Follow me," Mr. Santos said, leading Gustavo into the back office. The room was small, but neat, with a desk cluttered with papers and a computer screen that hummed softly. Mr. Santos motioned for Gustavo to sit down. "I've read your resume," Mr. Santos began, sitting across from him. "I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You've been through a lot. But what I need to know is this. Are you capable of handling this job? It's a basic office assistant position. Filing, answering calls, assisting with day-to-day operations. Can you do that?" Gustavo swallowed hard, his throat dry. This wasn't a high-paying job. It wasn't the job he had imagined himself doing, not by a long shot. But it was a job, and that's all that mattered. "I can do it," Gustavo replied, his voice steady. "I'll work hard. Whatever you need, I'll do it." Mr. Santos eyed him for a moment longer before nodding. "All right, Mr. Mendez. We'll start you on a probationary period. If you can prove yourself, we'll talk about a full-time position. Can you start tomorrow?" Gustavo's heart leapt in his chest. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much." As he left the building, his steps were lighter than they had been in weeks. He didn't have the job yet, not officially. But he had something now, a glimmer of hope, a small spark that might just turn into a flame. Later that evening, when Priscilla came by with her usual offering of food, Gustavo couldn't help but share the news. Eduarda was playing nearby, happily eating her sandwich, but the moment Priscilla saw his face, she knew something was different. "Priscilla," Gustavo said, his voice full of emotion, "I got a job. Well, I got the chance for a job. It's not much, but it's a start. I'll be working as an office assistant starting tomorrow." Priscilla's face broke into a wide smile, and for the first time in weeks, Gustavo saw a spark of pride in her eyes. "I knew you could do it," she said softly, her voice full of warmth. I knew you had it in you. He shook his head, overwhelmed by the emotion of it all. I couldn't have done it without you, Pri. You kept me going. You gave me the strength to keep fighting when I wanted to give up. You. No. Priscilla interrupted, her voice firm but kind. You did that, Gustavo. You found the strength inside you. You just needed someone to remind you of it. He smiled, the weight on his shoulders easing just a little. Maybe, but I'll never forget what you did for us. I won't forget. Eduarda ran up to them, holding a drawing she had made earlier. Tia Pri, look, I drew us. It's me, you, and Daddy. The picture was simple but filled with joy. 3 stick figures, each holding hands with a large heart above them. Priscilla smiled at the drawing, her eyes filling with tenderness. It's beautiful, Eduarda, she said, hugging the little girl. You're all that matters to me. All of you. Gustavo's heart swelled at the sight of them together, his 2 pillars of strength, his daughter and the woman who had shown him that life wasn't just about what you lost. It was about what you still had and what you could give to others. The following morning, Gustavo arrived early at the office, his nerves giving way to a deep sense of purpose. As he walked through the door, he was greeted by the receptionist, who led him back to Mr. Santos' office. Ready to start? Mr. Santos asked. Gustavo nodded. Ready. As he sat down at his desk, he glanced out the window, taking a deep breath. This wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a step forward. For the first time in months, Gustavo felt the weight of the past lifting just a little bit. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, he felt like he was finally walking in the right direction. And this time, he wasn't walking alone. You said. The days that followed were a whirlwind of work and determination. Gustavo settled into his new role as an office assistant, starting from the bottom, as he had to. But every task, no matter how small, felt like a victory. Filing papers, answering phones, and assisting with scheduling were all part of the routine. But to Gustavo, they were the first steps toward rebuilding his life. Mr. Santos was stern but fair, and while the work was nothing like the high-powered days of his tech business, Gustavo found a sense of purpose again. He focused on each task with an intensity that surprised him, driven by the thought of Eduarda, his daughter, who now had a future, even if it was still uncertain. And then, one evening, after a long day at work, he returned to the small apartment that Priscilla had generously offered them. Eduarda ran up to him, her eyes full of excitement. Daddy, look, I got a gold star at school today, she beamed, holding up her schoolwork. Gustavo knelt down to her level, his heart swelling with pride. That's amazing, Eduarda. You're so smart. Priscilla, standing by the door with a warm smile, nodded in agreement. She's doing great, Gustavo. And so are you. I can see how hard you're working. The weight of everything that had happened over the last few months, losing everything, feeling humiliated, and then fighting to rebuild, was heavy, but in that moment, surrounded by the people who had never given up on him, it felt lighter. I'm not where I want to be yet, Gustavo said, a smile tugging at his lips. But I'm getting there, little by little. Priscilla stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. You're getting there, and you're not doing it alone. We're all in this together. Gustavo looked at her, his gratitude so deep it almost hurt. She had shown him that no matter how far you fall, there's always a way back, even if it's just a small step at a time. Thank you, Priscilla, for everything, he said, the words coming out more sincere than he had expected. Priscilla smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. You don't need to thank me, Gustavo. You're doing this. You're the one fighting for your family. As the night settled in, they sat together in the small living room. Eduarda perched on Priscilla's lap as they talked about their day. The apartment was modest, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like a home. The journey ahead was still long, filled with unknowns. But for the first time in months, Gustavo felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for a future that was still unfolding. Hope that with every small step, they were moving closer to something better. He didn't have the answers. He didn't have all the plans figured out. But he knew one thing for sure. As long as he had Eduarda, and as long as he had people like Priscilla by his side, he could keep moving forward. And that was enough.